Imagine for a moment waking just after midnight and opening your eyes. You're uncomfortable and want to adjust position, but you come to the realization that your entire body is paralysed and you cannot move. It gets worse. While helplessly looking up at your ceiling, you become aware that you're not alone. There was no one else home when you retired to the bedroom, but now you sense that someone is close and your heart feels like it's going to beat out of your chest. The room is deathly silent for a moment, but suddenly a loud humming vibration is heard and felt all around you. Your eyes close and the sensation comes to an end. You awaken once more and you swear that you'd experienced surroundings unusual to you, and you can't shake the idea that you've been to a place unfamiliar. Your memory is foggy and a headache is present, but all you remember was having unusual dreams. As you're later going about your day, you notice bruising or very small scarring that you're absolutely certain that you didn't have before and can't remember how it happened. You're reminded of your earlier dreams and you wonder just what in the world happened, or is your mind just playing tricks on you? This is a variation of an experience that people have reported in relation to believing something highly unusual had happened to them. In 1992, July through September, Dr. David Jacobs, Bud Hopkins and Dr. Ron Westrom conducted a Roper poll. This poll questioned Americans as to whether or not they truly believed that they'd experienced this very thing and had been forcibly taken during their sleep. Interestingly enough, given the poll was a representative sample, they believed that 3.7 million Americans at the time would respond in the positive, and that amount of people would believe that they'd experienced this. So where did this begin, and why did this poll come to fruition? Dr. Mack, or John as we'll refer to him, was a psychiatrist based at Harvard Medical School, and after speaking with many patients, stated that there may be many hundreds of thousands of Americans who had experienced whatever this is, which through the Roper poll, the number was a lot higher. John stated that in his experience, attempting to fit these individuals' experiences into previously existing psychiatric categories and explanations only served to cause distress to the patient. He went on to encourage mental health professionals, when dealing with a patient presenting in this way, to be open to the possibility that something exists or is happening to their clients, which in our traditional Western framework cannot or should not be. John also said that clinicians should learn to recognise the most common symptoms and indications in the patient or client's history so that they understand that they may be dealing with a case like this. Psychologist Dr. Susan Blackmore, while paraphrasing John, among others, stated, "The indications that a person may have been taken included seeing lights, waking up paralysed with a sense of presence, and experiences of flying and being unable to recount a period of time." To clarify, the Roper poll did not simply pose the question, "Do you believe you have been taken by a non-human intelligence?" In David and Ron's opinion, posing the question in such a way was too simplistic and would be open for abuse in terms of lying. John, upon researching this topic through his own patients, and the patients of other clinicians, formulated a series of questions to assist in weeding out those who either may not be completely truthful in their response, or those who didn't meet the criteria. In addition, the authors argued that many people who believed that they'd been taken only remember parts of the experience after therapy, meaning that the poll would not have been very helpful anyway. Instead, individuals were given a card listing 11 experiences with available answers to determine the frequency of the experience. The answers to the following questions were, "This has occurred once or twice, more than twice, or never." The list of experiences themselves included 5 items that were more important, or rather to John, indicated that the patient could potentially have experienced something more profound. The less important experiences to John included seeing a ghost, seeing something you did not recognise flying in the sky, dreaming about such things, and also having an out-of-body experience. Now, as per John, the more important experiences, or indicator experiences as we'll refer to them, included waking up paralysed with a sense of a stranger being nearby, or something else in the room, feeling that you were actually flying through the air, although you didn't know how or why, experiencing a period of time of an hour or more in which you were apparently lost, but you could not remember why or where you'd been. Seeing unusual lights or balls of light in a room without knowing what was causing them or where they came from. Finding puzzling scars on your body and neither you nor anyone else remembering how you'd received them or where you got them. Two of the authors of the Roper Poll, David and Bud, worked with around 500 individuals over 17 years who believed that they'd been the victim of being forcibly taken by what they believed was this non-human presence. Over the years that David and Bud worked with these people, they noticed that these individuals had experienced 80% or more of the 5 indicators at least once. Thus, they determined that individuals who tested positive as experiencing at least 4 of the indicators were potentially people of interest. It's also important to clarify that these questions were posed to 5,947 Americans. But as said, those Americans were a representative sample of the overall population at the time. 119 of the nearly 6,000 people tested positively as people of interest, meaning that if it was truly representative of the overall population, as David and Bud were claiming, then that means that almost 4 million Americans may test positively as to having experienced enough of the 5 major flags. I created a poll and quizzed you guys with the Roper Poll, though slightly changed for brevity, so thank you very much to those of you that took part in the poll. Unfortunately, the poll itself is rather simple, so I don't get a full breakdown on individual voters that chose multiple options. But if you voted positive to 3 or 4 or more of these, then according to David, Bud, Ron and John himself, you may have qualified as a person of interest to them. As to them, they may see you as a person who has experienced something very out of the ordinary. Now, at this point, the question must certainly become, these 5 experiences, do they truly indicate that a person has been forcibly taken by something, or someone that we're not familiar with? Or rather, do they indicate that these individuals have experienced some kind of unusual psychological phenomena? Dr. Susan Blackmore stated, and I quote, "I reasoned that people who have been taken, whether they consciously recall it or not, should have a better knowledge of the appearance and behaviour of the non-human presence than people who have not been taken." Dr. Blackmore then lists the following hypothesis with 2 possible outcomes. The Roper Poll assumes that people who have had the indicator experiences have probably been taken. If this assumption is correct, then people who reported the indicator experiences should have a better knowledge of what these beings look like and what happens during the experience of being taken, than people who do not report the indicator experiences. If the assumption is not correct, then their knowledge should be no greater than anyone else's. Indeed, knowledge of this non-human presence should relate more closely to reading and television watching habits than to having the indicator experiences, if being taken by this non-human presence does not really occur. Or in other words, and to summarise that, Susan is saying that if the original hypothesis by David, Bud and Ron is correct, and people are actually being taken, then they should know more details about these beings, or people I suppose, and what they look like, and what actually takes place while in their presence. If the hypothesis in regards to the indicator experiences is wrong by the poll authors, then any knowledge the person reporting positive to the 5 experiences has about these beings likely just aligns with what you see from media exposure, such as TV or movies or books and the like. So with that, Susan then conducted her own experiment to shed some light on this. She gathered 126 young people of ages between 8 to 13, and 224 first-year undergraduates over the age of 18. Susan then read a story aloud about something unrecognisable in the sky and a girl who was visited at night by this non-human presence, who then took her into some kind of flying vehicle. A questionnaire was then given to everyone with 5 multi-choice questions. I won't go too deep into it, but Dr. Blackmore concluded the following. These results provide no evidence that people who reported more of the indicator experiences had a better idea of what these non-human beings should look like, or what happens during the process of being taken. Among the adults, though not the young people, there was a correlation between the amount of television they reported watching and their knowledge about these entities and being taken. Of course, there was more to Dr. Blackmore's study, and if you want to learn more about it, I'll leave a resource link in the description below. Now, I will say though, that while I understand the reasoning Dr. Blackmore used, it may not prove to be all that useful, because if these events really are occurring, we have absolutely no information as to what the motive might be. what technology might be used, or any substances that may be introduced to the individual reporting the experience. Before going further into this, let me just be clear and say that I have no stake in this topic at all, and I am not saying that these incidents are actually occurring or otherwise. I am not suggesting that people are either outright lying or telling the complete truth. Like most people, I have my own biases, and I tend not to believe that most incidents of this nature actually happened, though I do keep an open mind. Now, with that disclaimer out of the way, let's give this a fair shake. Let's have a look at a couple of reasons as to why individuals may not remember much or anything at all, and therefore do not and wouldn't actually be expected to have more knowledge about the perpetrators than the average person, as Dr. Blackmore suggested. Firstly, it is well documented, and psychologists know all about this. During a traumatic experience, fear overrides pretty much everything else. When this occurs, the rational part of the brain and prefrontal cortex are no longer the dominant force. Rather, the amygdala, the brain's fear circuitry, takes over. In turn, this determines where your focus and attention lies. Especially if helpless at the time of the trauma, this circuitry might take one's attention away from the perpetrator and towards some other meaningless detail, and this is what gets encoded into memory. For example, what you tend to find is that witness testimony is not a great way of identifying criminals, because when people find themselves in these stressful, dangerous scenarios, their focus will primarily be drawn to the dangerous object, for example, that the perpetrator could be holding, or some other element of the scene. But rarely the face or even the clothing of the criminal can be recalled correctly across witnesses. This actually brings up the whole problem of witness testimony being so highly valued in a court of law, but let's leave that tangent for someone else. In addition to this, and for the sake of argument, let's put aside the primary objectives this hypothetical force might have for taking people, since we cannot know it with any degree of certainty. However, let's assume for a moment that one aim that these entities have is to leave the victim with no memory of the incident, and they deem that as beneficial. So with that in mind, if that is even the case at all, are there any substances that we know of right now that have this kind of effect on a person? The answer to that is actually a resounding yes. One common substance that criminals have used on their victims is known as gamma-hydroxybutyrate, or for the sake of simplicity, and so I don't have to spend another 5 minutes trying to pronounce that correctly again, GHB. GHB is known to cause significant memory impairment, especially at higher doses, which can result in complete amnesia of any and all events occurring while the substance is active in one's system. It quite literally incapacitates individuals, leaving them totally unable to resist or remember what happened. Victims also report feeling highly confused and disoriented upon regaining consciousness, with a total gap in their memory, depending on how much of it they were exposed to. Now, of course, I am not suggesting that GHB would be or is being used by these hypothetical people or beings, or whatever we're saying they are. However, if we are to make the assumption that a minority of human beings are being taken by someone from somewhere else and then returned, then we have to assume that those who possess the ability to do this in the first place are so far technologically advanced than we are that the things that they might be capable of could look like literal magic to us. So the point being is that if we possess the ability to cause significant memory impairment in this way, I don't think it would be too far of a stretch that some kind of advanced force could achieve something similar, perhaps with an even greater potency. That's enough discussion for now though. Let's examine some reported cases of this very thing. Before discussing these incidents, I want to add an obvious disclaimer. I cannot verify that these incidents actually occurred. However, it does appear that the people making the claim that this has happened to them, at the very least, do fully believe so themselves. The first incident, as far as I'm aware, was brought to the forefront by an ex-policeman by the name of Tony Dodd. Tony became interested in this topic, spoke to various people, and documented some of these types of cases. I am not completely familiar with Tony's work or his books, but I do believe Tony popularised the following incident through his work. The year was 1988, and the morning of the 30th of March was a cold one. Helen Thomas resided in Birmingham, England, and lived nearby her mother, Carol Thomas. The pair of them worked at a mill not too far away from their homes, and would walk there with one another every morning. Helen and Carol had a specific route that they would take, and it was pretty much just the quickest way they knew of getting to the mill. This journey would take them through alleyways surrounded by old English housing estates. On that day, at first, this particular trip was normal, just like any other, and things were quiet. However, they would report that there was a sudden onset of some kind of humming. Not verbally, but rather, whatever this was, it was persistent and was causing the air and the ground to vibrate. The last thing they said they remembered before this humming stopped was, and I quote, "someone shining a bright torch," which is just a flashlight for my American viewers. They then talked about how weird that was and just carried on walking towards their place of work. Helen complained that her leather jacket was soaking wet and wasn't sure how it happened, as while it was cold, it wasn't raining. The pair of them reported feeling nauseous and confused but continued on their way to work. Upon arrival, the security guard gave them a heads up and told them that the boss was not best pleased with them because they were now 2 hours late. It was at this point that they realised that they could not account for the prior 2 hours and their journey only took a fraction of that time to reach the mill. Both Helen and Carol said that they didn't really know what to do with this information. They didn't relay it to anyone because they didn't know what to say or do and realised how crazy it made them both look, which is something they obviously seem to care a lot about, as would most people. 6 years after this incident, they relayed it to Tony in 1994. They also told him that for several weeks after that happened, they were getting random blisters on their face and arms. They also complained of suffering from headaches. It's not clear to me that Helen and Carol even thought about the prospect of being taken by something unfamiliar to us. I get the impression that they didn't know anything about this at all, but after talking to one another and reading about the experiences of others, they came to the conclusion that they had experienced something out of the ordinary. Tony suggested that both of them should see a licensed psychologist or psychiatrist to talk through exactly what had happened to them. Helen and Carol agreed, and it's at this point that things get weird, so let's get bizarre. Both of the women described and recalled the same story. They had both said that they remember being in a white room and believe they'd been laid down on a table next to one another. According to them both, they thought that there was a window running through the entire length of the room, but there was only darkness outside. They described there being a wet netted cloth placed above their legs. Around the table, they said were strange, small people with large heads and eyes. The description given was that they had long, thin arms and generally looked quite frail. They were an off-white colour and seemed wet and wrinkled. Both Helen and Carol said that their touch was cold, though Carol's report differs from Helen's at this point. Helen said that she was not able to remember anything beyond that, but Carol stated that they placed something cold against her belly button, which she thought was a glass tube. She said, and I quote, "I don't know how I knew what they'd done, but they'd taken eggs from me." At this point, we're going to have to get even more bizarre, why not? Carol said that she was taken to a screen on the wall, and symbols that she didn't recognise appeared on it with war footage playing. She also stated that she'd seen someone else, a person that was taller, had long blonde hair and blue eyes, who wore a silver suit and was wearing a blue badge. That was the end of what she said she could remember. Obviously, that went to some strange places there that you can't really do a whole lot with. But if you apply the assessment coined by John and used by the Ropopol creators, then the Thomases do seem to fall within some of the indicator categories. For instance, they both reported having a period of time that they couldn't account for. They said that they'd seen some kind of light or flashlight or something like that, and they said that their skin was blistering, so they'd experienced 3 out of the 5. Presumably then, I'd imagine to John, they could have been marked as a case of potential interest. I do just want to reiterate though, that it's impossible to verify accounts such as these, and I'll leave the integrity of that to you. Now at this point, let's discuss one of John's patients as of 1992, named Ed. I believe that Ed is an alias as opposed to the man's real name, and a surname wasn't given. It seems fairly understandable that if you believe this genuinely had happened to you, then you wouldn't want to be attached to it publicly, as most people are likely to have unflattering opinions about it. Anyway, Ed is a person that believes he'd been taken once, and also believes that he'd experienced some kind of contact numerous times throughout his life, beginning in July of 1961. Unfortunately, I'm not aware of Ed's age, but at that time in 1961, he had travelled to Maine to visit his friend Bob and the rest of the Baxters family. The Baxters lived in a cabin on the coast. Ed and Bob had been great friends for a long time and always made the effort to visit one another. This time, according to Ed, something happened that was completely out of the ordinary. As per usual, Ed was allocated the spare bedroom in the cabin, so he had it to himself. On one particular night, he had been spending time with the Baxters before retiring to his room for the night alone, where he fell asleep. However, during the night, he said that he woke up and was somewhere else. Specifically, after getting his bearings, he described that this unfamiliar room was more like a pod. He said, "The next thing I know, I'm out on this precipice in a pod, encased in some sort of glass bubble." He described that it was curved and transparent and that he could see the ocean outside, and presumed that he was still close to the cabin. In this thing, he described that he wasn't in his pajamas anymore and was wearing nothing. As he was examining his surroundings, he noticed that there was a woman behind him that he said didn't look right and was off somehow. I think he was describing the uncanny valley feeling. This is the kind of feeling where people feel a sense of unease or discomfort, or even repulsion when they encounter something that looks human but isn't quite right. This effect is quite common with lifelike robots or computer-generated characters or dolls that don't quite look right. Anyway, he said that she had long silver hair, a strangely large forehead and very dark eyes. Details are quite sparse here, but he claims that they engaged in a... yeah, you can see where that's going. Just think about the birds and the bees. Afterwards, he said that this woman imparted information to him relating to our treatment of the Earth, but also some spiritual and environmental lessons. He asked her if he could write down what she'd said, and she told him that he'd remember when he needed to know. After this incident, Ed stated that he felt as if his mental capacity had increased and took an interest in politics and the sciences. He went on to attend college and ended up graduating. While at college, he met and ended up marrying a woman named Lynn, who, when they were trying for a baby, said that they had trouble conceiving. Apparently, Lynn had experienced 4 spontaneous terminations, of which medical staff couldn't identify an obvious cause as to what was going wrong. Ed stated that over the years, Lynn had experienced bouts of time that she couldn't remember, and he wondered if that had anything to do with his own experience. I'm not sure if Lynn ever spoke to John. If we're to operate under the assumption that Ed and Lynn were being truthful, and they themselves, at the very least, believed that these things had occurred, this incident had a very different description to most cases in the sense that Ed seemed to have a better memory than others, and believed that he'd actually engaged with this third party. The conventional experience, if we can even call it that, seems to be more ominous and contains an element of secrecy, whereas whatever happened here seemed to want Ed to be conscious. Now, while believing himself to be truthful, could this have just been a dream that Ed, to his very core, felt was real? Who knows, but at this point, let's move on and have a look at another of John's patients. Scott, who was 24 years old when he first met John, had a long history of receiving therapist treatment for his anxiety. Scott had suffered from serious security issues for the vast majority of his life, describing his situation as such. I felt completely open to anybody to strike me down, or do whatever they wanted to. I was scared. I felt I could be destroyed. I did not feel safe at all. Scott's medical history showed prior treatment for frequent headaches, spells of dizziness and seizures. It seems that Scott's prior therapist was either slightly in over his head, so to speak, or just wasn't able to help Scott in any meaningful way. During one such session, Scott described exploring his childhood when a very odd memory came to mind. He told of being very young and playing outside in the dirt when he heard something behind him. He said that someone touched a metal rod that he didn't recognise to his head. This startled him and he ran back inside the house telling his mother that big ants were outside the house. In another session, his therapist would make a record of something to the effect of, "Patient is suffering from visual hallucinations," during which he would witness spinning coloured triangles as well as a female looking person leaning over his bed. Scott would come to be diagnosed as suffering from stress-related tensions with psycho-emotional components. Scott met with John towards the end of 1991, where Dr. Mack's goal was first to assess Scott's mental state and presumably to ascertain if Scott was truthful about his experiences, or memories I suppose. Scott's insecurities made an appearance when during conversation, he told John that he had a strong compulsion to ensure the doors and windows were constantly locked. He had the best security cameras and alarm system that period of time would allow, but nothing would ease his sense of vulnerability. John came to the conclusion that Scott was of sound mind and began to have more sessions with him. In one meeting, Scott described having partial memories of short people in his bedroom near the bed. And on a separate occasion during his youth, recalled seeing a circular shape that was rotating outside of the bedroom window. Scott wasn't the only member of the family to have problems. His sister, Lee, was diagnosed as having a serious fear of intimacy which had been present for as long as she could remember. Privately, Scott, among some others in the family, had speculated and wondered if she had suffered at the hands of an unknown family member when she was young. John took an interest in Lee upon hearing about this because, apparently, if one member of the family has experienced whatever weirdness this is supposed to be, often other family members may have too. John proposed a therapy session with Lee and she agreed to it. She would go on to remember what was described as an incredibly invasive experience during her early teens. She said that she had memories of being in a place that she didn't recognise with short people all around her. She said that she thought that they were performing some type of procedure on her. It does seem that Lee managed to find peace with it, or something to that effect, during her sessions with John, as she would state that she was grateful to these people who had taken her. She said it was a priceless opportunity for spiritual growth and sensitivity to sentient beings from somewhere else. That's an interesting contrast in perception between the siblings. Scott believed the experiences to be completely negative, while Lee, it seems, somehow saw some positivity in it. Now, while I have a background in psychology, which is what I went to university for, as I used to work with young people that had special educational needs, among other problems, I'm absolutely by no means properly trained or qualified to pass judgment or administer therapy or anything like that. There are a few questions that I'd love to know though. I'd love to know if similar experiences run in the family history, and I would like to know if any other neurological issues or disorders ran in the family too. I'm not sure if there are any studies that look at that, but it'd be a fascinating read to determine any kind of correlation there. Now, let's move on to John's next patient. Catherine experienced things slightly differently. In 1991, Catherine was 22 years old and she was studying music at her local college. To earn some money, Catherine managed to get herself a receptionist job at a nightclub in Boston, but one evening she stated that something very odd happened to her. Her shift at the club always ended at around 12 AM, and one night after finishing, she got into her car and began making her way home. She said that when she checked the time, she couldn't account for the last 45 minutes. She thought that her watch might have been broken, but upon arriving home, realised that her watch was correct. She said that she didn't sleep well that night, felt uncomfortable, and awoke with a major headache, which didn't really happen to her and was out of the ordinary. The following day, she saw news covering something weird that had happened over Boston, in which people had been saying that they'd seen a weird shape in the sky. Catherine then began to wonder if this had anything to do with her experience. One witness account of the sighting was by a police officer who said that he and his wife saw this thing, whatever it was, hovering with an intermittent light on the bottom. They observed it for a short while before it just disappeared. 2 weeks after Catherine had her experience, she couldn't let it go and sought out John to talk. If this incident, and just the topic in general, wasn't already strange enough, this is where things get bizarre, again. Catherine attended numerous therapy sessions with John, and during these sessions, Catherine discovered memories of unusual events spanning her entire lifetime. During very early life, perhaps around 3 years old, Catherine stated that one memory was really sticking out. She said that she recalled that she was in bed, but there was a blue light inside the room, and then she noticed, and I quote, "a funny looking guy was outside the window." She said that the man was peering inside the room. This is the description she gave. He had huge black eyes and a pointed chin. His entire head was like a teardrop inverted. He's got a line for a mouth and a nose I can't see totally well, but it's a bump. He doesn't seem to be wearing any clothes, and he seems to be an off-white colour. She continued and said that this person entered the room, but she wasn't sure how and was at the foot of a bed. She said that she remembered feeling like she was floating and seeing things moving around the room quickly. She said that her items were picked up somehow and then put back down. She continued and described that she was no longer in her room and that wherever she was, other young people were present too. She said that what appeared to be a nursery teacher passed a metallic rod to a young boy who used it to guide a metal ball around the room. All the kids did it, including Catherine, and each of them were praised. Apparently, Catherine was told, "You've done very well and we're very pleased with your progress." During another incident between the ages of 8 and 10, Catherine recalled waking up in an unfamiliar place and being unable to move. She said that someone with long fingers was in the room with her and reached to touch her. During her teenage years, her feelings changed towards these people and she was scared of them, where before she was not. She recalled being laid down on a white table with someone looking down at her, scrutinizing her. She said, "Their eyes, they're very, very big. I can't see any pupils. I can't see the retina, no whites or anything. It's all black." She said that their eyes looked soulless, and she had unpleasant feelings of being like some kind of subject that they didn't care about. She was then taken into another room, in which there were smaller, baby-like versions of the people who'd taken her, inside what she described as transparent cases in the wall. She said that the other walls were transparent, and that she could see trees and large rocks. She couldn't remember any more of that incident or how she returned home. In 1990, a year before meeting John, she recalled travelling to Alaska to visit her mother, but again, one night she woke up in a place that was not her mother's house. She said that the room was like a big fish tank and the walls were curved, but she couldn't recollect any more than that. Psychiatrists Richard McNally and Susan Clancy wanted to gain a deeper understanding of this topic and conducted a study in 2005. In short, they assessed 10 individuals who believed that they'd been taken by these things. All 10 of them had experienced sleep paralysis. In addition, they assessed other adults who had memories of abuse during their early years. They found that these individuals could remember experiencing sleep paralysis more often than a control group who had a safe early life, meaning that there could be a correlation between experiencing abuse and sleep paralysis. Other researchers note that sleep paralysis has been reported as causing hallucinations. It has been argued that this experience of sleep paralysis has caused people to experience some kind of illusion of the beings that have taken them, alongside the reported lights and other visual effects. Dr. McNally and Dr. Clancy state this in their paper. Sleep paralysis is a common, albeit often frightening event. How a person interprets it depends on the available cultural narratives. For example, ghostly hauntings, being taken into the sky, neurological disease, and their personal credibility to the person seeking to explain this remarkable experience. In other words, the person is unlikely to tell you what they truly believe happened to them if you appear as though you think they're lying or crazy. The doctors continue, "It is unclear why some people opt for this interpretation of being taken by these beings, whereas others assume that they are being haunted or that they must have been dreaming after all, even if they know that they were awake. It is unclear why one cultural narrative is favoured over another," meaning that the researchers were not sure why sleep paralysis sufferers opt for being taken more than the being haunted narrative. Finally, not all individuals experiencing sleep paralysis seek explanations for it. Some simply shrug it off as weird and inexplicable occurrences. I find what the doctors said early on there fairly compelling and highly worthy of note. They are essentially saying that when researching sleep paralysis on this area, they found that depending on one's culture, the individual is more likely to place blame on something that relates to it. I'm assuming then that would mean in countries such as America, you'd be more likely to attribute the experience to being taken by these beings, where perhaps if you lived in other parts of the world, you might be more inclined to blame it on something else. I suppose the ultimate question in the end is, are people truly experiencing being taken by another people from somewhere else, or is there a more mundane explanation such as hallucinating the event in its entirety? John and the Roper-Pole trio seem to lean towards the idea that this was actually happening, whereas others do not. I did find this interesting article, titled "The Psychiatrist Who Wanted to Believe" on The Lancet by Neil Boyce, who studied medicine at Oxford University. The article goes through some of the main criticisms levied at John over the years, and how his credibility faded too as some of his peers deemed him crazy. Edward Kantzian, a clinical professor of psychiatry and a friend to John, said, "It is a shame that's the tag that's often put on him. He was not crazy. He was a man that was guided by his interests. He's searching for all kinds of truths. And I think he got caught up with a faulty instrument. The instrument in question was hypnotic regression. During John's sessions with patients of his who'd believed they'd been taken, John would use this technique. But as Dr. Chris French of the Anomalistic Psychology Research Unit of Goldsmiths College stated, the problem with hypnotic regression is that you pretty much get what you expect to get. If you go into a session expecting to recover memories of being taken by something not of this earth, that's most likely what you're going to get. If you go in thinking you're going to recover past life memories of being Mary Queen of Scots, then that's what you'll get. There were further criticisms of John as he was essentially tricked in 2001. A journalist by the name of Donna Bassett with the Los Angeles Times posed as someone who had experienced being taken by these things. She managed to convince John that she'd been taken during the crisis with Cuba, and while up there with these beings had watched a conference between Kennedy and the Russian leader. While not ethical, it's not a ringing endorsement of John's ability to determine if someone was lying to him, or seeking attention, or whatnot. I get the sense actually that John was a very kind and empathetic man that did truly care about his patients and wanted to sympathise with them as best as he could. I do truly believe that he was trying to help people as well as he possibly could. I wonder to some extent if his good nature might have been his undoing in some sense in regards to all of this. The article is worth a read and I've linked it down below with the other resources. While critical, it's not disparaging to John and ends as such. John was held in very, very high regard until he got into this area, and that part of him that was such a great leader and a great mentor, I never saw it wane in spite of those interests. I believe that Mac was wrong, but he may, at least, have been wrong for the best of reasons, and with the best of intentions. With that, I'd like to know your stance on this. Do you think that John was right in seeming to side that there is something out of the ordinary genuinely happening? Or do you think it's more of a hallucination or something else? Please do let me know. Thank you for watching. If you found the video interesting, then please do leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already, it helps me a lot. If not, then feel free to leave a dislike, I'm just looking for your honest opinion either way. I'd also just like to say a special thank you to the patrons who've been running around on the screen. I hope that you've had a great day, or evening, depending on where you are. Be safe guys, and have a great weekend. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.